Good afternoon, welcome. I'm Eve Patton, and for a few more weeks I'm director of the Trinity Longroom Hub, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you all, or welcome you back to this special symposium that we're holding today to mark 10 years of our signature public series, Behind the Headlines. And if you have just joined us, you'll find on the seats there is a brochure which will tell you a little bit about the history of the Behind the Headlines series and how it's operated. And I might take a minute just to reiterate my thanks to everybody who has been involved, all the people who've supported the series, all the people who've spoken at the series, many of them are in this room, all the people who've come along in the audience, and particularly the John Pollard Foundation. And I can see in a timely manner that Stephen Vernon has just come into the room. So my thanks again to the John Pollard Foundation, which has given us its trust and support over the past few years for this series. Earlier this afternoon, we began the symposium by reflecting on the role of archives and archivists as repositories of truth. This second panel is devoted to the question of how world events are rendered into the headlines. What is the news? How do we safeguard it in the face of AI, of aggressive ideologies, the fragmentation of contemporary media, and above all, how do we safeguard it when there is violence against journalists themselves? The CPJ, which is the International Committee to Protect Journalists, reports that since the start of the war in Gaza, just to give you an example, 178 reporters have been killed, 37 are still in prison. To introduce and chair this panel, we're delighted to have with us a long-term friend and advisor to the Trinity Longroom Hub, Bruce Shapiro. Bruce, a journalist and academic indeed, with wide-ranging expertise in this field, is currently with us here in Trinity as a visiting fellow from the Dark School of Journalism and Trauma at Columbia University. And many of you will know that Bruce is also going to be giving our annual Humanities Horizons lecture later on this evening. But in advance of that, he has generously and energetically agreed to lead this conversation, and he'll introduce the panel who are going to discuss Behind the Story, Can the News Survive the Times? Bruce.
I'm going to say a few things to add to what Eve said to frame this situation, this conversation, but then we'll simply turn it over to the panel. Each of our speakers will talk for about 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up to conversation, just as we did in the first panel if you were here. Should also say before I leap into it that this panel is being recorded for future broadcasts, so don't say anything that would embarrass your children or your grandparents or whoever else might be listening. We are really fortunate to have a panel today of extraordinary both range and expertise, people I've either known or known about and admired for a very long time. And we'll begin down at the far end with Daniel Geary, who's the Mark Piggott Professor in U.S. History here, Trinity College, Dublin. His research focuses on the intellectual, political, and cultural history of the 20th century United States. His books include Beyond Civil Rights, The Moynihan Report and Its Legacy, on my shelf at home, a cherished volume, and Radical Ambitions, C. Wright Mills, The Left, and American Social Thought. You can read him as a regular contributor to the Irish Times, and he's written for Jacobin, In These Times, the Boston Review, and a whole lot of other places. Razan Ibraheem, next to him, is an Irish-Syrian journalist with expertise in verifying social media content and media literacy. She's worked with Kinzen and Storyful and social media news agencies and provided research for the New York Times, Pulitzer Prize-winning investigation in 2020. She's here on her own behalf today, not representing any of the folks she's worked for. She's a regular contributor to Irish radio and TV programs, and her work has been featured in local and international media outlets. She was named International Woman of the Year by Irish Tatler in 2016. And she was on Tommy Tiernan not too long ago. Deirdre McCarthy, next to her, is the managing director of RTE News and Current Affairs, a job she's held since December 2022, leading RTE's news coverage of national and international events. She is the first woman to hold this position. As part of RTE's leadership team, Deirdre plays a key role in continuing RTE's journey of transformation in responding to ongoing change, makes her singularly relevant to this conversation today. Previously, Deirdre held the role of managing editor of regions and radio news programs at RTE and was also RTE's political coverage editor at Leinster House. And finally, on my immediate left, Rory Carroll is from Dublin and started his journalism career with the Irish News in Belfast before joining The Guardian, where for over 20 years he has worked as a foreign correspondent covering the Mediterranean, Sub-Saharan Africa, Iraq, Latin America, and the United States before returning to Dublin as The Guardian's Ireland correspondent. He's the author of Killing Thatcher, a reconstruction of the IRA plot to assassinate the British Prime Minister in Brighton in 1984. As Eve suggested in her opening, we are here at a time of polycrisis in the practice of journalism and in the news industry. It's multi-layered, some crises long-standing, some newer and more escalating. Of course, there is the long-standing crisis of trust in democracies, in the news media. There's the crisis of technology, AI, social media, all the rest of it. There's also the pre-existing crisis of rising authoritarianism, which has now accelerated into a global assault on press freedom, consisting, as Eve said, in part on attacks, threats, social media hostility, the actual killings of journalists, whether in Gaza, whether attacks on journalists in the US, you name it, but also on multiple other fronts. The legal front, SLAPP suits, strategic lawsuits against public participation designed to intimidate journalists and news organizations with completely unlawful but nonetheless expensive lawsuits. The demonization of journalists as enemies of the people, validating attacks on media from the very highest levels of governments in democracies. All of these mark our time as one in which the future of news, on the one hand, is probably more important than it's ever been, and on the other hand, is more challenging than it's ever been. And we're going to talk about all that today. We're going to go in order. I'm going to start by asking Daniel to bring his historian's perspective to this singular moment. And again, 10 minutes, I will make funny noises if you start to go over.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you to the Hub for inviting me to be here and to mark this anniversary. And I think we at Trinity, I think in Ireland more generally, are just very lucky to have this institution here of the Longroom Hub. Now, unlike my fellow panelists, I'm not a journalist, I'm a historian. And one thing that whatever topic you're discussing, a historian will always tell you is, it happened earlier than you think it did. And that's basically the point I want to make today with regard to the crisis that we're in today, which has long roots and of which the crisis of the media is, I think, only one component. We can trace this crisis all the way back to the 1970s, the corrosive distrust in civil institutions that is so evident in the United States today. And as a historian of the US, I'm going to focus my comments there, but I think what we see happening in the US is happening throughout the developed world, even in Ireland, although here, thankfully, we're a bit behind the curve. I want to begin with the Watergate moment of the early 1970s, when the American press played a pivotal role in bringing down the presidency of Richard Nixon by exposing his corruption and abuse of power. The scandal centered around the break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate Hotel, part of a number of dirty tricks played by the Nixon campaign in 1972, and then the cover-up of that break-in by the nation's highest officials, including Nixon himself, were caught red-handed on tape. Most Americans at the time were truly shocked and surprised by these events, the congressional hearings and press coverage that lasted months and exposed just a whole range of illegal actions by the Nixon administration. This had followed on, of course, from the key role the press had played in exposing the lies of the Lyndon Johnson and Nixon administrations regarding the U.S. war in Southeast Vietnam. The rise of the national security state during the Cold War gave American presidents enormous power to act, but in the 1960s and 1970s, these secrets were exposed, and it was the media, along with whistleblowers and mass movements, that did this exposing. As a result, public trust in American government fell from 77% in 1964 to 36% at the time of Watergate. And though it did rise a bit at times after that, the long-term trend has been downwards ever since, to the point where public trust in the American government stands, the federal government stands at 20% today. Now, we might distinguish between two different kinds of distrust of the government and public institutions more generally. There is, I think, a left distrust, and there's a right distrust. During the 1970s, it seemed that a left distrust might have succeeded, that would have sought to build a more open and democratic society. Had the Watergate scandal been exposed during the 1972 election, the presidency might have been won by the Democratic candidate George McGovern, the anti-war senator who ran on just such a campaign platform. And I'm sorry, but I can't help working McGovern into my talk because I'm writing a book about him. Also, he's my favorite presidential candidate, not only because of the politics, but because he was a historian. He even taught in Ireland for a year, albeit at UCD. And most importantly of all, his father played in the minor league system of my favorite baseball team. Now, so McGovern represented, I think, a real movement that was so far advanced that it, he was able to be one of the major presidential candidates, even though he didn't do very well against Nixon. But I think there was an effort in the 1970s to build on a distrust of government that would build institutions that would be, in fact, more trustworthy and more democratic. And the press was certainly part of that. And indeed, if you look at the polling in the 1970s, it shows that trust in media remained high, even as trust in government was declining. So the trust in media at the time of the Watergate scandal was 70%. So about twice as many Americans trusted the media as trusted the government, suggesting a possible role for the media as holding the government to account and preventing the kind of abuses that had occurred during Watergate. Journalists even became cultural heroes, as happened with Washington Post journalists who exposed the Watergate scandal, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, portrayed by Hollywood stars Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman in the 1976 film All the President's Men. I don't think you can imagine such a mainstream movie being made today. But ultimately, of course, it was not a left distrust that prevailed, but a right distrust that undermined public faith in democratic institutions in favor of big money and presidential authoritarianism, which didn't just begin under Trump. We didn't get George McGovern, but we did get Ronald Reagan, who portrayed government as the problem and who turbocharged the skullduggery of the national security state. Public trust, meanwhile, public trust in the media could not remain high, I think. It didn't remain high with such low trust in government and other public institutions. Indeed, public trust in the media fell steadily since the 1970s to about 30% today of Americans who say they trust the media in general. Most astonishingly, this trust has fallen so far among Republicans to the point where today only 12% of Republicans claim that they trust the media. That's an astonishingly low amount. Presumably they trust some right-wing outlets, but the mainstream media they simply do not trust. That puts journalists today in a difficult situation because while they can and should expose scandals, today's Watergates, such exposures can't have the same impact today if the public doesn't trust journalists. They distrust them nearly as much as they distrust the politicians. and if indeed trust in journalism has become effectively a partisan issue in the United States. And indeed, the public's overall distrust in institutions leaves people with little outrage that things could be any different. And this is how Donald Trump has managed to survive an unbelievable amount of scandals, any one of which would have sunk a president in the Watergate era. Trump has so many potential Watergate moments, but the relationship between the media, the government, and the public just doesn't work the way it did in the early 1970s. And this, as a historian, I don't have any practical advice for journalists on how to operate in such a challenging context. My fellow panelists can certainly speak better to that. But I do know that you can't simply just urge people to trust institutions in the media. That, I don't think, is going to work, because Americans have good reason to distrust their institutions, whether that be the emergence of gross economic inequalities, or the lies that were told during the forever wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, in which much of the media was complicit. And the disillusionment with those wars, I think, directly led to the rise of Trump. So I think that right distrust has to be countered with a revival of that left distrust, one that leads not just to suspicion and criticism of institutions, but to a movement to seriously reform them so that they would be more deserving of public trust. As John Dewey once said, quote, "The solution to the ills of democracy is more democracy." And I think the media, certainly along with other civil institutions, must play a vital role if democracies are to not just survive into the 21st century, but to thrive. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's an absolute honor for me to be here today. So is journalism losing its voice? No, but something is. The journalism we grew up with, the old school kind of reporting, formal, slow, scripted, and shaped by editors behind closed doors, that kind of a journalism is gasping for breath, and perhaps it's time to let it go. But journalism itself, the mission, the purpose, the fire that drive someone to risk their life in a war zone, or spend years digging through leaked documents to hold the powerful to account. That journalism is still much alive, because journalism is not a format, it is a force, it's the voice of the unheard, it's the shield of the vulnerable, the enemy of secrecy and abuse. And it's still shaping and changing the world. Journalism has shaped has played critical role in shaping major global events. It was the Pentagon Papers that exposed the lies about Vietnam War, the Watergate, that brought down a US president, the Panama and Pandora Papers that cracked open the hidden wealth of the global elite, the NCA file that revealed mass surveillance, the Uyghur files that uncovered detention in camps in China. Even now, during the war in Sudan, it was journalism, not diplomacy, that forced the world to look. Journalism is not dead, and it will never die, but traditional reporting and legacy mainstream media, that's another story. They are in decline, and maybe, just maybe, it needs to be. Do we really want to save it? When 6 corporations control what 90% of Americans watch, read, and hear, when just 3 companies dominate the UK's newspaper and market, when even here in Ireland, a small number of groups shape the national narrative. This is not journalism, this is information monopoly. And without concentration of power has come something far more dangerous, collapse in public trust. People no longer believe what they are hearing, and more worryingly, they don't know who to believe, because truth is not, or it doesn't sit behind a news desk anymore. It is on the ground, in danger, and often fighting to be seen. I first saw the shift while I was working to verify content on social media from war zones like Syria, where activists broke through the barrier of traditional reporting, capturing airstrikes, chemical attacks, and human rights abuses in real time. And I watched how legacy media began relying on their footage to tell the story. And I am seeing it again now, during the war in Gaza, where citizen journalists and ordinary people are once more in the front line, capturing what traditional media cannot or won't show. Even the most reputable outlets hesitated, distorted, or fell short, failing to tell the truth or the full truth, provide context, or report fairly. So the public turned away from the cable news and from the legacy media. Instead, they turned to social media, turned to Palestinian journalists filming bombing on their phones, to raw, unfiltered truth, because they knew, and that the filtered version was compromised. People turned to social media because it gave them fast, first-hand, straight from the ground, something traditional media and traditional news couldn't keep up with. So where we are now, we are at a turning point. Traditional reporting is no longer gatekeeper. Mainstream media no longer has exclusive control over what information reaches the public. The public has left the cathedral. They are gathering in the town square. And in that town square, they listen to voices that they feel real, not perfect, not polished, not corporate approved. These days, when some people want to search for news, they don't turn to news websites. They open TikTok or X. Some people trust TikToker filming from their bedroom more than an anchor with $1 million studio. The podcaster in a hoodie more than a news reporter in a tailored suit. The freelance war reporter risking everything with nothing but camera and conviction. Because in the world of spin, authenticity is the new authority. This is the authenticity economy, and it fills the vacuum left by traditional reporting and dying legacy institutions. And let's be honest, inside traditional news, the war between journalism and commercial pressure has already been lost. Algorithms now dictate editorial priorities. Advertisers shape what's publishable, and the wall between business and journalism, it's rubble. So what do? We stop mourning the old, we build the new. Journalism is not dying, it is being liberated, freed from the conventions that made it feel elitist, distant, and slow. And it is now it is faster, rawer, more human. Yes, it is messy, but it is also democratic, more diverse, more real. Yes, it makes a space for misinformation and disinformation, but it also demands sharper judgment, media literacy, and renewed commitment to truth. This is the rebirth. In this new era, the journalists are not gatekeepers, they are guides. Not guarding access to information, but helping us make sense of the news. Cutting through noise and tackling complexity, eliminating what matters. Helping us make sense of chaos, separating news from noise, truth from deepfake. And this is where AI enters the conversation, because in this new media landscape, the pressure to publish quickly, cheaply, and constantly is stronger than ever. Many are turning to AI as a solution. AI in journalism offers profound advantages. It can automate routine reporting, analyze massive data set in seconds, fact-check in real time, and even personalize news for individual readers. But let's not kid ourselves. AI also brings profound risks. It can hallucinate facts. It can spread misinformation at scale. It can reinforce bias, threaten jobs, and erode the very thing journalism stands for: human judgment, empathy, and ethical responsibility. AI can be powerful, but it's not and will never be a journalist. Because truth, I have 2 lines. Absolutely. Because truth is not just about data, it's about context, integrity, and conscience. And they are always be human. So the future of journalism is decentralized, independent, and human, and it has personal sense of connection. So long life journalism, not the legacy, not the corporate brand, but the truth, raw, real, and really unstoppable. Thank you.
Actually, I'm going to begin. I have a few key points that I want to get through, but I'm going to start with the phone. I think that's the best way to illustrate the challenge that we've had for a number of years, but it's the real challenge, is our phone. It's the device. It's one device that many of us use to access information, content, in my case, news. So the RT News app there, Guardian, Irish Times, they're all there for us. So I'm going to come back to this point in a while about devices, because that tells us about how our habits and behaviours have changed. And that's key to understanding the challenge that we now face and how we deal with it. But back to the legacy bit, and as we tend to talk nowadays, we talk in linear and digital terms. So for news and current affairs and RT, that's everything, from your 169 o'clock news to your morning news at 1 this week, to your leaders' questions, to the RT Investigates unit, to current affairs, to prime time, and most importantly, everything you read on our online platforms. And it's not just our app, it's also social media platforms. So what's happened there? There's been just an explosion in the number of platforms that we now serve. And we understand what our audiences are looking for, and also how they consume their news, and in what way they want to do it. So that's an awful lot has changed. But as the public service media company, we're also still obliged, and we're bound by our legal and regulatory obligations. So we have to do key things as well, which we're absolutely delighted to do. That's why we're here. But we also face the challenge of trying to reach newer and younger audiences with our news content. So I'm going to start with a positive, because the challenges have been well outlined, but there are positives here. We know from our audience research that those newer, more diverse and younger audiences are really, really interested in news and current affairs. That hasn't changed. People still want accurate, factual information. And that's really, really key. But firstly, how they access that has changed. And this goes back to my point about habits and behaviours. It has changed. It also has changed how they look at it and how they act, and they scroll. We all scroll now. We don't even know we're doing it. And if you go onto a social media platform, how do you get your news there? So there was a time when we'd expect the audiences to come to us, and you'd sit down and watch your 9 o'clock news, or you'd turn on your radio and you'd listen to the news, or you'd buy your newspaper and you'd read it. Now we have to go where the audiences are and almost catch them as well. Catch them. Now we are doing that, by the way. So it's not that this is still something that's out there and that media companies like my own haven't. We are actively doing this, but there are challenges in doing this as well. But key to this is that younger audiences are interested in news and current affairs. Really, really important. Part two is not only accessing the news, but the verification of the news. The speed at which news is consumed now is incredible. 10 years ago, some of these social media platforms didn't exist. There was a time when it was your traditional morning newspaper and your evening newspaper, or your 6 and 9 o'clock news, or your radio. You turned it on the hour. Now you can consume your news 24/7 on various platforms, all at different times. The other big challenge is that social media has opened up journalism to the world, and everyone has a viewpoint now, and can have a viewpoint, and can have something to say. Some people call it journalism, some people call it citizen journalism, some people call it just opinions and views. But what will stand out and continues to make us relevant and important is that we can stand over what we publish. So the facts are really, really important. And being accurate is important. And impartiality is important. Objectivity is important. You know, we're not the only media organisation to come under huge, immense pressure at the moment in relation to the coverage of the Israel-Gaza war. People question about our approach. Why are you being Why are you being impartial? You're standing aside. You're not taking a viewpoint. You need to take a stand. Because what does impartiality means? It means that we're not just taking it from one view. Our job is to provide the audiences, the readers, listeners, viewers, followers, with a variety of views and let you decide where the truth is. Our job is to make sure that you're informed. If we decide to take a particular view on something, on a particular issue, then we're not doing our job, because you're not getting the other viewpoints or hearing them. Not everyone agrees with this, but this is really key, because it shows that we're not biased. And if we can do that, it means you will trust us. And going back to the point here about trust, RT News levels, we're still the most trusted source across all the platforms at the moment. I don't say that lightly. I don't want that to change. I need it to grow. So there's a big job here to continue to convince people to trust the news that we give them. We will do that if we're accurate and factual and give them the information. And one other key point, we will also do that if we're transparent in what we do. And what do I mean by that? Is that when we get it wrong, we put our hands up, correct mistakes. We have feedbacks and complaints continuously. We have a whole area that looks after that. People ring me, write to me, send me notes directly. And I read and listen and watch everything, just in case we haven't got it right, or it needs to be changed, or there's a particular viewpoint that we didn't consider. When you do that, you're working hard to try to maintain trust. It's hard to keep, it's difficult to keep, but it's very important that we keep it and try to build on it. And that's not just a challenge for RTE News, that's a challenge for all organisations. I just want to make one other point, if I have 1 minute, okay. So just in relation to mis and disinformation, this is a huge challenge, and social media has really, really exposed and opened up the challenges that media organisations face in challenging disinformation and misinformation. So we launched a new mark, Clarity, to try and attempt to do this. Now, this is not easy. Disinformation is difficult to challenge, because the verification processes, the amount of effort and work that goes into actually challenging disinformation, and that you can come out and say afterwards, yes, this was disinformation. Misinformation and correcting the record is difficult too, but it's less of a challenge. But in terms of disinformation is the big challenge that we all face in media. And yet there are utterances and statements made every single day that are not necessarily true. And it is our job to try and correct the record, but this takes time and it takes resources. And I know people say to me, you are a large newsroom, You have a whole new newsroom of people. But with the pace and speed of the way stories are published, it is a big challenge for us to try and call out disinformation when we see it. Thank you.
And firstly, thank you to the Hub for the invitation, and thanks for all for turning up. I'm going to speak kind of to all these themes, but in a kind of narrow sense. I'll just be reflecting my own experience as a reporter with The Guardian. Firstly, a bit about how The Guardian, how we're, as legacy media, how we're trying to survive, adapt, keep our heads above water in this environment, financially as well as ethically, and just keep ourselves relevant. And then I'll talk a bit about how I, just as a reporter, you know, the kind of the humble end of the lowest end of the food chain, really, of our organisation, you know, how that affects me. About a decade ago, there was already this, you know, panic in legacy newspapers about how we're going to survive, because digital or advertising revenues are crashing. Facebook and Google were kind of eating our lunch. Circulation of print copies were collapsing, and so you know, who's going to survive? And the main solution was paywalls. You know, that if you can get subscribers, and they will pay for a digital subscription. The Guardian decided to go for a different route, and they said, no, we're going to keep. We're not going to have a paywall. It'll be free online. Anybody can access it, and because we're going to assume that readers will just be so lovely, they're going to just give us money for free, for nothing. Even by giving us money, you're not getting anything extra, really. And I heard this. Can you still hear me? I heard this being outlined by a managing editor about a decade ago, and I thought I need to look for another job. You know, because you know we're screwed. So how can this possibly work? It just seemed against human nature. And I'm delighted that I've been largely proven wrong, that this kind of reader-driven model that doesn't have a paywall has largely worked. Now to this day, about 40% of Guardian revenues come from reader revenue subscriptions. This is people, hopefully like some of yourselves here, who choose to contribute to The Guardian, maybe for €4 per month, or one-off payments. Not because you need it to get access, because it's there anyway, but simply because you feel it's the right thing to do. And I mean, The Guardian has become very adept now. They invest a lot in the psychology of how to kind of guilt people into giving us money. You know, if you read to the end of the article, it'll be, you know, things will pop up, and often in a kind of annoying way, but kind of maybe funny way, and you know, and largely it works, and they're kind of tweaking this all the time. So the good news is that we now have, like in the US, for example, more than half of all of our US Guardian revenue comes from readers and just contributing. So that's all the good news. The bad news for us is that, is this happening fast enough? Because meantime, our print circulation continues to, I'm not sure I could be thanked by my editors by saying to dive, but it's declining, just as it is for almost all newspapers. And advertising revenue continues to be a challenge, and so the question for us is, you know, can this reader revenue compensate for the stuff that's, you know, dying elsewhere? Last year we lost £39 million, which wasn't great. It's not terrible actually, but you know, it's a challenge for us. Even though The Guardian has been credited with, you know, reinventing the wheel a bit in terms of this model of journalism. Even for us, it's still almost like a daily, annual struggle to keep our heads above water financially. Now, I wanted to talk about this links to polarization, because there's actually, for us, a silver lining. You know, if you think of the past decade, Brexit, Donald Trump, COVID, the full invasion of Ukraine, Gaza, Trump again. Now, for a lot of people, they just want to curl up under a duvet when they hear all of those words. And yet, for us as journalists, and especially specifically in The Guardian, in many ways this has been I'd say good news, in that readers are hungry for information, because maybe because they're worried about things or they're excited, but they, all of these huge events are happening, and it's difficult to make sense of it all. And so where do you go? In a fragmented landscape, you want to YouTube or your social media channel, but really, you want to go to some, sources that you're inclined to believe or to trust. And so our traffic, the amount of people who click on our articles always surges when these events happen, like certainly during elections, or if there's some, theater happening in the Oval Office in the White House. Within minutes, we get these metrics. You can see the traffic surging, and that's good for us because the more there is a loose correlation between the amount of traffic we get onto our website and the amount of people, the amount of contributions we get from readers. It's imperfect, but there is a correlation there. And so this is traditional in a way because it used to be that and I think it still is, that in Britain under a conservative government, Guardian circulation used to do really well. And then because, the Guardian readers wanted to kind of, or left-wing readers wanted to, get, hoping the Guardian might be giving a kicking to the Conservative government, or they're worried about what Margaret Thatcher was doing or David Cameron, and so they'd be more inclined to buy the Guardian. Likewise, under Labour governments, the Daily Telegraph would actually do really well for similar reasons. So when I mentioned about the polarization now with be it Trump or Gaza, it's a similar dynamic that's unfolding. Now, the trick or the challenge for...
Okay, you got 1 minute.
1 minute. The trick of that... Hang on, I've been timing this. This is 6.5 minutes.
All right.
You
go for it.
Yeah, fake news.
Fact check. All right.
Is how do you... Okay, so it's silver lining for polarization, but what... how do you retain your credibility as a reporter and as an organization? Because our readers love stories that give Trump a kicking, Trump and Freud. You see it, any articles or opinion pieces that have like Trump's in trouble, Trump is going mad, Trump, the traffic will explode. And so of course the temptation is, well, this is catnip, we can do this all the time and we get lots of traffic, but your credibility will suffer unless it's actually serious journalism and thought gone into behind it. Plus you can't be giving readers what they want all the time, it's like, well, Trump is doing really well, well, that's, you need to do that. And this one little example, I was in the US for Trump's first campaign and presidency. I remember covering Trump rallies, and you go, and often for me the most valuable is not necessarily what he's saying on stage, but just talking to the people around him, talking to the people who chose to be at the rally and who were they, and I basically do a vox pop and maybe interview between 10 or 20 people. And at the end, you got a notebook filled with, lots of, scrolls of who these people were. And then I'd sit down and try to kind of impose a kind of narrative, which didn't quite exist really, but have to kind of to string it all together. Like, who are these people? And it's so easy to demonize them, stereotype them, make them sound like idiots. Because if you interview 20 people, you're going to get some idiots. There's, 20 people at random, except for Trinity College, of course. Clearly, it would be, guillotine. But and so there was a temptation because also that would do again really well with traffic because Guardian readers would love that is what they would want to that's what they want to believe. But I was often struck doing these vox pops at Trump rallies and also Ted Cruz rallies that how nice people were. People tend to be quite normal and very American, very polite and kind of normal. And it was only later on I thought, well, if you're worried about Trump, this is even more reason to worry about Trump. It's not that he's appealing to fanatics or right-wing militia types. It's regular folks, and they're very nice, and they, and so I would, in my little way, try to, encourage or nurture the trust in the Guardian brand by including those voices in the story, and say, hey, look, here's so-and-so, and this might be a sympathetic character who's voting for Trump, and here's the reason why, and I wouldn't consider myself, like any form of Olympian impartiality, but you want to be fair and accurate, especially fair, and to fairly represent the opinion of people, and even people whom the average Guardian reader may recoil from. And so that's one little way that we just try to maintain, in a sense, trust in legacy media, for which I very dearly hope that there is still a future.
You can always tell a reporter who doesn't let his editors push him around on deadline.
9 minutes.
We are going to go to questions from the room.
Yeah, it is all about trust, but there's different parts to trust. There's different key component parts to ensuring that trust levels continue. And I think that's where this should be focused. So it isn't necessarily about the figures on the Reuters report at the end of the year and it's how do you sustain and build and maintain the trust levels that you already have. What does that mean? What does trust mean, particularly to newer and younger audiences who are digitally transformed and don't look and read and listen to legacy media? They don't. There's a whole generation out there of under 40s who never look at a television screen in the corner, who don't turn on a radio. They listen to podcasts, they scroll through lots of different apps to get their news in and consume their information. That's what has changed. The habits and behaviours have changed. It doesn't mean that they won't trust us, but how do we get to them? How do we connect with those audiences that they might? What do we do that can ensure that they will stay with us, right? So, for RT News in the last couple of years, we focused specifically on Instagram and TikTok, and we're up to 1 million followers now. Really important key milestones for us. How did we do that? The journalism still stayed the same. The journalism, the verification process, standing over our stories. Generally, on most stories, it's 2 sources before we'll publish. So that's part of it. But the other part is understanding how news has changed, how you tell the story has changed. It needs to be shorter and it needs to be able to connect. So we know from the audience research and from younger audiences, they want to be able to connect to the story. So that means the traditional, more formal way of telling the news, we need to change depending on the platform. But the journalism in the story is still the same. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Yeah, can I add just quickly? This is excellent point. Thank you for bringing that. When it comes to the statistics and the American media, one of the reasons, and I personally brought that, because American media's influence in the world is great. It's unbelievable influence. I know the focus would be US audience, but news like CNN and even Fox News and all these big media organizations, they don't stay in the US. They are not limited. So that's why that concentration, I know it will just very American-centric, but because the influence is profound on the whole world and it dictates as well the story, because with that journalism, or I'd say with that story, it will dictate politics. And we know American politics affects everyone in personal lives as well. So that's as well one of the reasons why I think it is important point, but as well to bring that from this perspective. But thank you.
Yeah, that's right. The Associated Press refused to call the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America, and hence they were excluded. Yeah, so obviously there is an attempt to promote certain, what you might think of as kind of fringy right-wing outlets, and to suppress institutions that are critical of Trump, and this is going on across the entire society, which is troubling in a way. Although I suppose the White House press corps has never been the best source of investigation of the administration, and has often served to kind of parrot what the administration is saying. Allowing if you go back to the kind of the Watergate era in Vietnam, it was the media reporting what the administration was saying that was getting all these lies out there. So I'm not sure that going back to the status quo on that is such a good issue, but it is quite troubling that there is a concerted effort to attack media, universities, law firms, what have you, that are not going to silence their criticisms of Trump.
Yeah, well, I get wax lyrical about the good old days when, if you're in the, for example, if you're a British or Irish correspondent in the United States, what you'd be doing is you'd be delivering, yesterday's news tomorrow, because you'd be sitting there, you'd have breakfast, read the New York Times, Washington Post on a Monday, and they're reporting the news from the previous day, and then you pitch that to your editors, and then you file it later that day, and then people in England or Ireland are reading this on a Tuesday. And that was the pace. And as I mentioned earlier, just how slow it was. But we didn't know it was slow. That was just the way it was. And that gets a bad rap now. But there was value to that you did have time to think. Sometimes you think about things a bit more deeply. Whereas now, the pressure, it's with rolling news, it's kind of like, oh, if I mention something, it's like, oh yeah, could you file that within an hour? Like an hour to do a story, right? Of course, it's possibly because it'd be on the RT website. Great, I can, I can access it, and if I can, see where the sourcing, and if I need to, double check things. But it's the speed is so accelerated now, and that can be fantastic, but also can be challenging. And sometimes this, like the blur of news. And I remember when I was in Jerusalem last year. This is when we didn't have access to anyone else to Gaza, except, as we've mentioned, citizen journalists and Palestinians who are there, and we were so reliant on them. But I remember it was just exhausting because you're sitting there in Jerusalem trying to just process this endless kind of blur of news, of press conferences, bombings. Then there's a video on YouTube of a bombing and rival claims about who did it, and then it can be overwhelming. For the individual reporter. So you can only imagine for, you're trying. In this case, you are sort of the gatekeeper for the news consumer, and it's increasingly I'm beginning to think it's a young person's game, because it's you need to be able to mentally multitask in a way that we never had to do before.
I can answer like this as citizen journalists. To that example, a lot of people are misusing that term or citizen journalism just to get away with what they are doing, or give maybe credibility to their work. But definitely, I completely agree. There are some examples of horrendous stories happening against minorities and refugees, etc., which is completely wrong. But I believe it's misused, because when you are, for example, looking at citizen journalists they were in Syria, for example, or in Gaza right now, they educate themselves as they go. And I know personally examples of people who started they were doing their job like a nurse in a hospital. It was bombed. They brought their mobile, and they completely shifted their career in one incident, and they became journalists. But they brought that mobile, and that maybe the first experience was not in a way responding. It was responding to a horrendous situation. Day by day and incident by incident, they start to acquire the skills. They started to read, educate themselves, and they are on the ground. So we like the integrity of journalism and the citizen journalism, they can definitely work together, and I believe in their role. But definitely it is misused by a lot of people, and this is very, very wrong, I believe. Yeah.
Yes.
I think I share a concern there that media can become an echo chamber, and that if now when you're telling, in a sense, your readers what you think they want to hear, because if they think otherwise, then they go to a different organization. And so it's up to the individual reporters and editors, I think, to try to challenge, their own readership or the core values of their readers. But you can't do it all the time. You need to kind of pick your battles and frame it in a way that's careful. Just one little example. When I used to cover Latin America, I remember going to the Amazon and interviewing a guy who's cutting down the rainforest, and he completely believed in what he was doing. I mean, he was a logger, but he had a very sophisticated analysis and defense of why he was doing that, which is fascinating. And so somewhat tremulously pitched that to the Guardian, said, this guy's, and to their credit, they took it. They took the story, and sometimes I think nowadays, especially with so much polarization, we need more of that. And when I mentioned earlier about, for example, interviewing nice Trump supporters, sophisticated, articulate Trump supporters. Why do they support him? We need to understand that. But that's a daily battle, and we don't always win it.
Yeah. So here's my last question for each of you. We're here to answer the question, will the news survive the times? Quickly, one or two words really for each of you. What do you see as the greatest threat to the future of meaningful, impactful news coverage? And what is your greatest source of hope? And Rory, I'll start with you, and we'll end with Dan.
Well, one threat is that the news is so depressing. It's such a turn-off. I mean, I struggle myself, and it's just so kind of being distressed about it is gloomy, and so that's a problem because people will literally switch off. And one solution, and I think legacy media can do this sometimes rather well, is to include some light and with the shade, arts, culture, jokes. We need that, and so that's one way to keep the wheels turning.
And greatest hope, source of hope.
Jokes.
Jokes. Okay. Deirdre.
I think one of the greatest challenges is that the news is so serious and so heavy. It's very challenging to expect people to having to keep watching and listening all the time. And that doesn't seem to be getting any easier. That is a huge challenge. On a positive, again, as I mentioned, from the audience research we've done, it's really positive that we know younger people are interested in news and current affairs. I think that's a huge positive, and that they want, accurate and factual information. And that's really important for the future. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with the 2 points. I'm going to add authoritarianism. I think it's a big threat for news and for journalism, and we're not seeing that only in the West, if we're going to name it, but it's also as well in the Arab region, in Russia, in China. All the authoritarian definitely is the biggest threat, I think, for journalism, democracy, truth, facts. And the one hope, I think it's if we go back to our authenticity, as I mentioned in my paper, I think authenticity right now, it's becoming so important. If the audience are believing, trusting, and starting to see that the reporter, or even the article or whatever, they are actually connecting and they feel there is a trust, I think there is important one too. And I believe we are probably heading to make it that way.
Daniel, historian's perspective.
Yeah, I think the biggest threat is right-wing authoritarianism, because I think that journalism is basically fundamental to democracy, and democracy is under threat. And I'm sorry to say, but there is no hope. I'm only joking about that. But I'd say with regard to the U.S., we've seen kind of let's say a political conflict between a party and the Democrats who've basically said trust the system versus a right wing which has said you can't trust the system. And I think in a period where people are not trusting the system, that lends a lot of power to the right. But I think there's been a parallel movement on the left. We saw it with the Bernie Sanders campaign. We see it with the left wing of the Democratic Party. And I think the movement, even though it's not so obvious right now, I think it's really growing. I think a lot of people are really angry. They're really frustrated. They're really thinking, what can we do? Not just to say, let's go back to before Trump, but what can we do to really, revive our democracy? I think that would do a lot for media as well.
Okay. Can we thank our panel, please? To Daniel and Razan and Deirdre and Rory.